Hey sixth graders, this video is going to highlight how to take Cornell Notes as you're reading a text. And I'll be honest, taking Cornell Notes is a new task for me, so I'm also learning myself. But I've also learned that it's a very effective way to record notes and to help you remember information. Let me read the directions for you. So it says, for Cornell Notes, you will write the essential question, take notes, write questions, and write a summary. Use the Cornell Notes template below to take notes about similarities and differences of Dakota and Ojibwe. On the next page, take Cornell Notes on early Ojibwe fishing practices. We'll get to the fishing practices tomorrow. Alright, so here's the text we're going to read. This is a bit shorter than probably most texts you would read when you take Cornell Notes, but just for the sake of instruction, we're reading a shorter passage. And then I decided to make a Cornell Notes frame for you. Normally I would have you handwrite this. It's basically an offset letter I. So if you can see, like, here's the top of the capital letter I, here's the bottom, and then here's the middle. So you got a capital I. On the top of it, we're going to write our essential question. So that's the whole purpose of what we are reading and taking notes for. This is the area where you will take notes, and to be honest, you could actually draw notes. You could make a list, you could do a Venn diagram, you could do it a lot of different ways. And for this section over here, you would write any questions you have or main ideas. Then you'll use the notes and the questions idea section, main idea, to write a summary down below. So let's get started up here. Now it did say take notes about similarities and differences of Dakota and Ojibwe. So this will be your essential, basically be your essential question. So what are similarities and differences about Dakota people? And then you will write that in this section right here. All right. The next thing we're going to do is highlight information that will help us answer this question, keeping this question in mind, similarities and differences with early Dakota and Ojibwe. And I don't have a real right or wrong answer about how much to highlight. Often I'll highlight more than I really will use for notes, but I'm just going to do the best I can to focus on this question. So I'll read this and then highlight as I find information. The Ojibwe arrived in what is now northeastern Minnesota in the 1600s. All right, in the 1600s is important to me because we know that Dakota have lived in Minnesota for thousands of years. They were in many ways much like their Dakota neighbors. So now it's going to talk about how they're similar. They're much like their Dakota neighbors. They were woodland people who felt at home in lands surrounding the Great Lakes. Okay, they're woodland people. I also know that Dakota were plains people as well. They lived in villages in the cool pine forest surrounded by relatives and neighbors. Okay, so they lived in villages in pine forests surrounded by, okay, relatives and neighbors. They fished, hunted game, harvested wild rice, and made sugar from maple sap. Every individual contributed to their community. Some people were leaders while others made music or healed the sick. The Ojibwe were also different from Dakota, so this paragraph is probably going to talk about how they're different. They had their own language, customs, and beliefs. Instead of using teepees like the Dakota, they built wigwams, okay? More permanent houses with round frames. Okay, that's interesting. These frames were covered with woven mats or sheets of birch bark called wigwas in the Ojibwe language. The Ojibwe also used birch bark to make canoes. Instead of hollowing out logs like the Dakota. Okay, logs like the Dakota. Okay, so now the trick is figuring out which notes should I take. Now, since the question here was what are similarities and differences, something that comes to mind is maybe make a Venn diagram. So what I did was make a Venn diagram, and I took those notes. So I'm just going to adjust the camera here a little bit. So I have a section for how are they the same, how are the Ojibwe unique, how are Dakota unique, and I looked through my notes and what I highlighted to see what would make sense and how much can I fit. I can't fit everything here, that's okay. You have to leave some things out, but the point is to get a good idea. So I found that in this paragraph it talked about how they're the same. They've both been woodland people, lived in villages, they fished, hunted, they collected wild rice, maple sap. In this section it talked about how they're different. So they both had their own language, customs, and beliefs. I wrote that on both sides. Language, customs, and beliefs. Here it said that the Ojibwe built wigwams while the Dakota lived in teepees. So for the Dakota I put teepees, Ojibwe I put wigwams. Ojibwe also used birch bark to make canoes instead of logs like the Dakota did. So if under Dakota I put log canoes, for Ojibwe I put birch bark canoes. I also included this, that in the early 1600s is when the Ojibwe arrived. I could also add that the Dakota have been there for thousands of years, just ran out of room. Now I need to make a paragraph. So similar to using the race strategy, I want to restate my question. So the question is, what are similarities and differences with Dakota and Ojibwe people? Well, I'll start my response by restating that. So I put, there are a number of similarities and differences with early Dakota and Ojibwe people. So I just decided to start with ways that they're similar. So I'm writing a paragraph with these details here. They both lived in woodlands and in villages. They fished and hunted and harvested wild rice and maple sap. And now I'm going to talk about how they're different. Okay? They have a different language, customs, and beliefs. Dakota lived in teepees while Ojibwe lived in wigwams. So I got that information from here. You may remember Dakota lived here for thousands of years while Ojibwe arrived in the 1600s. So I added that detail. All right, so this is a basic template for taking notes, taking Cornell Notes. One thing I did forget to mention was after I take my notes here, I want to reflect on it and ask myself some questions just for the sake of helping me, and it helps me remember better. So some questions I came up with, like, was why the different languages? The Ojibwe and the Dakota were living so close to each other. Why would they have different languages? Oh, another one is, which canoe would be easier to build, a log canoe or birch bark? So I'll put log versus birch bark. And it's the very act of asking the question that can help you remember the notes that you're taking. All right? So in summary, you have a text. All right? You have areas you're going to highlight. In your Cornell Notes, you need to ask a question. You need your essential question to help you with highlighting. You'll look at your highlights and write them down as notes. Reflect on them by asking questions. And then finally, use your notes to write a summary. All right, this is my first lesson on Cornell Notes. I hope it gets better and better. Thanks.